A fairly common crop for many gardeners and growers are beetroot, or simply beets in other parts of the world. And although I've grown this vegetable for many years, it's not a crop that I've done a lot of exploration with. Although there are a few different types of beetroot available, it's not known for its diversity, with most varieties seeming to be fairly similar if not interchangeable. Until fairly recently, I had been growing the same open-pollinated variety, one that I had randomly selected many years ago as a general-purpose beetroot. I never really knew if it was a good choice, and I suspected that some of the issues that I had with this crop could be improved by using different varieties. In the past few years, I have also been growing a hybrid variety for harvesting as younger plants, but I wanted to do a proper variety trial similar to what I have been doing with many other types of vegetables. So I started to collect seed packets of different beetroot varieties and probably ended up with way too many to properly compare, but perhaps that made it easier to select a few. I do like beetroot as a crop and enjoy eating it, though I do want to explore additional ways of using this vegetable in the kitchen. It is a crop without any significant pest issues, at least in this context, apart from birds and slugs eating the seedlings. There have been some disease issues, but not a lot in my experience, or at least I was able to ignore the minor damage that did occur, and I haven't experienced the plants bolting, which seems to be more common in warmer climates. Overall, it is a fairly easy crop to grow if I can get it past the seedling stage, and it can be really productive and is easy to store. I also like the fact that the entire plant can be eaten at any stage in its development, including seedlings or microgreens and early or later thinnings. They are also great to use as baby beets or semi-mature roots with their leaves still attached, or as fully mature roots for storage, at least until they start the process of developing seeds. And they can be eaten raw or cooked, though that depends on their quality and how well they were grown, and of course on your taste preferences. Some beetroot contain compounds that give it an earthy taste, and some people seem to be more sensitive to this and don't like eating beetroot for this reason. I don't notice this earthy taste very much, but I have noticed another issue with a bitter or astringent aftertaste from some of the beetroot that I've grown, and sometimes it's so bad that it makes the beetroot inedible. I'm not sure the reasons for this problematic aftertaste, but it might be due to poor soil development or nutrient deficiencies or imbalances in the soil. It could also be due to inadequate watering at times during the summer, but that's not really an issue most of the time here in Ireland. It is also possible that this occasional bad taste was more common with the beetroot variety that I had been growing. And this was one of the key reasons why I wanted to do a large variety trial of beetroot, to see if some varieties were more or less susceptible to acquiring this bad flavor. I also didn't know if the variety I had been growing was the best option for productivity or flavor, or at least how it compared to other varieties that I could be growing. I was also interested in exploring the possible diversities with beetroot as a crop, though I suspected there wasn't going to be much difference. At least not compared to crops like tomatoes, which have a huge range of different tastes, sizes, colors, shapes, and uses. So a few years ago, I started to buy seeds of different varieties from different suppliers, but once I started to collect varieties, it was hard to determine when to stop. This was also affected by Brexit, after which I would be losing access to some really good seed suppliers in the UK, which have varieties suitable for this climate that are not available here in Ireland, or from the other supplier that I started to rely on in Germany. So I ended up with seed packets of 24 different beetroot varieties in total, which is a crazy amount, but I figure I could at least store this collection in my freezer for many years. I grew a trial of all of these varieties in 2022 in a spare bed beside the older polytunnel, but there were some issues with overshadowing at one end of the bed, so some of the varieties were not really comparable. And I didn't pay enough attention or properly evaluate all the varieties, probably because there were so many and it seemed like such a big task. So I decided to try again this past year in 2023 with a full variety trial in one of the polytunnels and in one of the outside gardens. The beetroot variety trial that I grew in one of the larger polytunnels was for an early crop of semi-mature beetroot. This is a summer salad crop where the whole plant can be harvested when the roots have grown big enough to be used in a number of different ways, and the leaves and stems are still in really good condition. I have had good success growing beetroot early in the season in polytunnels like this in the past, producing big yields of tender beetroot in late spring or early summer. And with a lack of wind and heavy rains in the shelter of the polytunnel, the leaves and stems of these plants remained in really good shape. I direct sowed the seeds of all 24 varieties in one of the beds of the polytunnel at the beginning of March. And to ensure full germination, I sowed several seed clusters in each station about 10 centimeters apart in short rows across the bed. I was aiming for one cross row of about 9 plants for each variety, with the rows spaced about 25 centimeters apart, giving a density of about 40 plants per square meter. At both ends of this set of 24 rows, I left enough space for an additional 2 rows of the usual variety that I grow, to act as a buffer to ensure that each variety had similar growing conditions. There was good overall germination, though there were a few gaps, especially with some varieties, possibly due to poor quality seed. When we thinned the seedlings, we tried to leave 9 plants for each variety to make up for any gaps, but this wasn't possible with some of the varieties. The plants grew really well, and we started harvesting a few plants from each variety around the middle of May, about 10 weeks after sowing, and then we harvested another batch from each variety about a week later. And at the end of May, we pulled up the remaining plants of each of the varieties so that the bed could be used for other warm season crops. The typical or median total weight produced by each variety was just under 3 kilograms, or about 300 grams per plant, producing a total yield of almost 15 kilograms per square meter, which is a huge amount to be able to harvest from just 3 months of growth in the polytunnel in the spring, but some varieties produce considerably more than others. I had tried to harvest a comparable amount from each variety at each harvest, but this wasn't always possible. This variation probably contributed some of the differences in yield between the varieties, as the plants were able to grow quite a bit even in the last week of growth. And the gaps in germination definitely contributed to considerably lower yields with a few of the varieties. So this yield data from this one planting is not so reliable, but it is interesting to see that some of the varieties produce considerably more than the median or typical. And one open pollinated variety and a hybrid variety produce considerably more than the rest, at least in this context when weighed as a whole plant. Of course, weight or yield is not the only factor. Appearance, quality, and taste are also really important, especially with a solid summer crop like this. 4 of the varieties were a different color or shape, and 2 of the varieties were more elongated for pickling, offering the only obvious diversity within the selection. The other 18 were all variations of a typical beetroot, with roughly round, dark purple roots and striped purple stems with bright green leaves. We tasted a sample of all of the varieties, but tasting 24 different raw beetroot can be a bit of a challenge, and thankfully none of them had that really strong aftertaste that can be difficult to get rid of. The 2 varieties with yellow roots were quite interesting looking, but didn't taste good compared to the others, and were quite woody. And a variety with longer pointed roots with white rings inside had quite an unpleasant flavor. But another variety with white roots and pink rings had a really great taste and a soft texture, which was really nice to eat raw. And the 2 longer varieties had a decent flavor, which would serve as a good base for pickling. With the other 18 varieties, which all looked very similar, there was a fair amount of variation in the amount of sweetness and the depth of flavor. A few of them did have traces of that bitter or astringent aftertaste that I was keen to avoid, and the taste lingered as we sampled others, so it was difficult to isolate the more we tasted. It was a challenge to adequately evaluate them all in this one sampling, and I think I would need to do several tastings, possibly with more people. And to try them all cooked, to figure out which ones I really liked the taste of for different uses. It was interesting that the variety that I had been growing for so many years tasted quite good in comparison to the others, and the yield was also relatively good. So it seems I picked a reasonable variety all of those years ago, at least for growing in this context. With the 2 varieties that produced the heaviest crop, the hybrid variety also tasted quite good, but the open pollinated variety tasted quite bland, which was disappointing. I repeated the same trial outside, sowing all of the varieties in one of the beds of the no-dig garden at the beginning of June. Unfortunately, too many of the young seedlings were eaten by slugs or birds, so I decided to abandon this trial and sowed the same trial again in another bed of the no-dig garden at the beginning of July. This delayed planting meant that it would not be a great crop for harvesting as whole plants with good quality edible leaves, which would have made it more comparable with the trial in the polytunnel. But it was decent timing for a crop of mature roots that we harvested in late autumn for overwinter storage. Overall, this crop was quite good, with a typical or median weight of about 2.75 kilograms for each variety, with an overall yield of about 11 kilograms per square meter. These plants had grown through the late summer and the full autumn and were subjected to very different growing conditions compared to the plants growing in the polytunnel, and there were a few issues with the roots. A rat had chewed on a few of the roots, and I'm not sure if this was just random or if the rat had searched for the better tasting varieties. A few of the varieties had split roots, and there was significant decay or rot with some of the varieties, and less pronounced decay with other varieties, and some of them had other types of blemishes on the roots. All of these would impact the storability or usability of the roots. But with a single small trial like this, it's hard to determine whether this would be just a random occurrence. But I'm tempted to assume that the varieties are more susceptible to these kind of issues. Some of the varieties had pronounced differences in the size of the roots that we harvested, which may indicate a variability in the variety, which isn't necessarily a problem, and other varieties were surprisingly uniform. With so many varieties and a lack of time and capacity, I decided to mix all of the varieties together rather than keeping them separate in storage so that I could properly evaluate them later. But with all of the roots of the different varieties that we have eaten so far, I haven't noticed any of that bitter aftertaste that I was hoping to avoid. So perhaps it is more of an issue of growing conditions and less dependent on variety selection. It's not so easy to select from so many different varieties, but at least I can start to narrow down the field based on these two trials. Between the two longer varieties, I didn't notice much difference between yield and taste. So if I wanted to grow a patch specifically for making sliced pickled beetroot, I would probably select the variety that was slightly less curved than the other, simply for making slicing a bit easier. I didn't like the taste of either of the varieties with yellow roots. There were some serious issues of rotting with the roots of one of them, and it also seemed to be present in the roots of the same variety that had grown in the polytunnel. So I would definitely avoid that variety in the future, but I might give the other one a second chance if I can find some better quality seed. I was not impressed with the variety with long tapered roots, but the variety with roots that had pink and white rings tasted really good and grew really well. Even with the one split root and the rats sampling some of the others, this is probably the only unusual colored variety that I would want to grow again. Among the 18 other more typical varieties, the one hybrid variety is the only one that really stands out, with considerably higher yields in both trials. The early plants of this variety from the polytunnel were healthy and strong with really good flavor, though perhaps not the best tasting. The late season roots were cleaner and in better shape than any other variety, with no signs of blemishes or rotting patches. And they were more consistently large and well shaped than the other varieties, and I didn't notice any woodiness or bitterness with the one that I cut open and tasted. And all of this makes the extra cost of the hybrid seeds seem reasonable, at least at this scale. Selecting an open-pollinated standard variety of beetroot to grow is a bit more difficult. It may be easier to first eliminate varieties that had significant signs of rotting, cracking, or had misshapen roots, inconsistent growth, yellowing of the leaves, or had low yields or a poor taste. Even if some of this is more of a random occurrence than something that is typical of that variety, with so many to choose from, it doesn't really matter. This leaves about 8 open-pollinated varieties of a typical type of beetroot that didn't show any obvious issues within these two trials. So that leaves only really taste and yield differences to select between them. The most productive of these open-pollinated varieties was quite bland tasting, and the late-season roots had one spot that seemed to be starting to rot. A few that tasted better and were reasonably productive in the earlier cropping didn't taste so well in the late season crop, but it may still be worth growing mainly as an early season crop, and this includes the variety that I've been growing for many years. And there is one that stood out as having really good flavor in the single tasting that we did, and produced a reasonable yield of good quality plants and roots in both trials. So this variety might be the one to grow if I was to select one open-pollinated variety to rely on for my main crop of standard beetroot. And that might be good enough, at least in this context, possibly together with the higher yielding hybrid variety, a more interesting variety with ringed roots, and a variety for pickling. But I might find that in other gardens with different soil profile and fertility, or in a season with significantly different weather, that these varieties might not be the best options. But I'm really not going to know unless I do additional large trials, and I should probably figure out how well they all store and to spend the time to properly evaluate how they taste. And perhaps with growing lots of varieties in different contexts, I might finally figure out what causes that bad aftertaste, though I don't really want to taste it again.